Hello and welcome to today's ResBaz session titled, Is Your Science Causing Your Laptop to Burn? Before starting, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which we're broadcasting. That's the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and extend that acknowledgement to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders joining us today. I'm Ann Buckhouse, and I'm the Education and Training Manager at the Pawsey Supercomputing Research Center, located just down the road from Curtin. And joining me today are Dr. Chris Harris and Dr. Pascal Alahi. So as you can see, we've got a busy 60 minutes planned for you today. This session is interactive, and we look forward to you fully participating because we all have a lot that we can learn from each other. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Pascal.
Thanks, Anne. So we'll start off with a very simple, a scheme for what a workflow is, for an easy research workflow. And the sort of overall arching envelope for a workflow might be that you collect some data, you then bring it together. So there's maybe a couple of different collection points that you pull data from, you then stage it for processing, and then you process it. You turn that raw data into some sort of scientific output. That scientific output maybe need to be visualized in some fashion so that you can then interpret the results and also present results to others. And finally, you want to archive those results, stage them and save them for later use and also distribution. Now, in terms of our research workflows, so I should provide that I'm a supercomputing application specialist at Pawsey, but my background was computational astrophysics. So to give you a sense of what my workflow was when I started my PhD and in my postdocs, I was often involved in running cosmological simulations that would produce essentially data that needed to be processed. So it was a multi-stage workflow. I would essentially running on supercomputers to produce simulation data, which then I take that data, staged it, so I collected and staged the data, but then I ran the processing on supercomputers again to convert the rather complex raw simulation output into more manageable scientific output, and then visualize them and then archive them. And so the workflow that's presented in these figures is not necessarily a simple unidirectional workflow. There's actually a lot of different workflows that are present in, obviously in your science, in your work. Mine's not the only one. Chris, would you like to briefly mention what type of workflows you've had?
Yeah, so my research was in signal and image processing. So for me, it was taking the signals that have been collected, and my research was looking at using GPUs to accelerate the processing of those signals, graphics processing. So for me, my workflow was around transferring the data onto those processing units and doing the work there, and then pulling the data back. I think one of the big points where I kind of realized that I needed to use supercomputing came about when I looked at all of the, data points that I needed to collect to finish my honours that I was working on at the time. And I added up the time that it would take, and it was longer than the end of my submission for my honours, right? So I wasn't going to get it done in time. So I went to my supervisor, and she had recently installed a visualization lab, which had 9 GPU workstations. And so I was able to kind of cut up the work that I needed to do across those workstations and run them overnight when they weren't getting used. So that kind of reduced the time that it took to run the test that I needed to finish my honours thesis and get it done in time. So yeah, that was my, first engagement with this kind of work.
Yeah, so it brings up an interesting point, right? Chris, he had data and then realized that he needed a supercomputer. My start point, at least when I was doing my work, was the very simulations that I want to analyze. At the very start point, needed a supercomputer. There was no way I was going to be able to actually run my simulations on a desktop with the memory required. And even if I had all the memory needed to run the simulation, it would have taken quite a long time to run it, on the order of months to years in some of the cases. So my start point was, well, I need to I want to study something, and that requires cosmological simulations, and those require supercomputers. And then I had to process that, and that the data volume was large enough that I knew I had to use supercomputers. So there's different points at which of entry where you might say, oh, that's when I really need something bigger than possibly a laptop. And of course, this is the goal of this presentation, is to get you thinking about this. And to emphasize as well, right? You've just heard Chris and myself talk about workflows, but there isn't. It's not a simple unidirectional simple workflow that can require a point at which you're like, oh, I need to maybe migrate to something more complex and really think about my workflow. So, you know, I want you guys to think about your workflow. We're going to have a discussion. So, you know, think about what you're actually doing. Collection of initial data. Is that actually really complex? Is saving the data? Is your data volumes really huge, perhaps? The processing, or even doing something else, is that really complex? Does that require, or would that eventually require something like a supercomputer? And even visualizing, I mean, it's possible that someone's workflow might be taking large amounts of data and then generating a rather simple plot, nothing too complex, but that reduction process to visualize it might be quite complex, which was my case. So the idea is to have a conversation about what your workflows look like. Do you have what does it sort of break it down into sort of subtasks and figure out this is the steps in my workflow. And also I think about, you know, can you make your workflow easier, or is it going to be even more complex as you go along? So at this point, I think we should have a discussion.
Yeah. Yeah, at this point, it would be great if you have a pencil or pen and paper, and just we'll give you a minute or two and just kind of think about and jot down your flow. What does it look like? You know, what is there a single box, you know, for each of these? Are there multiple boxes? Are they for you? Because yours, it's going to be unique. It's going to be different.
Yeah. The example that I can think of is that usually processing, right, that's in a single box here might be really a multi-stage process, right? But the end result might be that you're taking some data and you process it in a variety of different ways, and then you visualize. So just start jotting down ideas of what your workflow is, flesh it out. Feel free to ask a question, of course, if something is unclear. We're happy to help.
Hi guys, how you going?
Hi. Yeah,
I
good.
really like the Pawsey new logo, by the way.
Oh, cool, thanks.
I have I guess I'll speak up if no one else is, but I have used Pawsey before, and I still do use Pawsey. My biggest issue is that I am a combination of a wet lab and a computational scientist, and it's revisiting my workflows 6 months later that I find the most challenging part at the moment.
Right.
Yes, that's what I need to get better at documenting. Past me is not, I'm getting better, but past me creates lots of issues for future Siobhan. And yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to better preserve those workflows and reuse things rather than reinventing the wheel each and every time.
Which of our infrastructure are you using? Are you using Magnus or Nimbus or one of the other courses? So
I mainly use Nimbus day to day, purely because it allows me that flexibility that I can't necessarily say I need X number of supercomputer hours in a month. Often, like, I don't need it for a month or two, and then I need it lots. Yeah. And so obviously it's just easier to get on Nimbus. I'm a genomics person predominantly. So most of the workflow is okay on Nimbus. There's probably one step that would be better on Magnus, but again, it's probably not to the level that you guys would usually get researchers. So it's hard to get access to sometimes because I only need it for a really short thing. So most of the time I would say Nimbus is okay, but it's just more revisiting the workflows and things like that.
So can I ask you, is your workflow quite dynamic as well, in the sense it evolves with time, or you have very different things that you try to do sometimes, or is it somewhat static?
I would say like it evolves more because it has to with like new algorithms, new programs come out.
Sure.
But I would say not not hugely. Like it's typically now, it's been a couple of years now, and I think I've got a pretty good workflow, like base workflow, and different algorithms may sub in or at different stages, which is not a massive issue at the moment. But yeah, it's more just revisiting those workflows. I find that like things, one package updates and everything else. And I have been listening to the recent container workshops that Pawsey's been running. But again, because I'm not at the moment doing a lot of computational stage in my workflow, often the motivation doesn't come until I need to do it. Which is maybe not what you guys want to hear, but that's...
Well, I think that's very natural.
I mean, I'm glad that you're looking at containers, because that at least is a way of preserving and documenting some of your workflow, right? Because it's essentially frozen in time to some extent.
When you're working on a workflow, are you doing things sort of step by step, working through them by issuing commands, or do you have, I guess, some sort of workflow management tool that you've been working with sort of everything and like making an update and sending it off to do it all?
Yeah, no, I'm not using everything's very manual at the moment. I don't use again, it's one of those things where there's so many out there, I never know which one to pick, but I don't know if you guys have any pointers or if it's just a matter of picking one and going with it.
We've definitely run some workshops in the past on a couple of different workflow tools, and I wonder if this is a sign that we probably need to pick them up and rerun them again.
Yeah, so I would say that all of them are pretty good. Typically, we've done. I know lots of people have, because we've held workshops on Nextflow, which is a workflow management tool, and there's some documentation there, but realistically, they're all almost equivalent. It's just how you want to write the workflow, but what you end up writing is essentially the same. So possibly the advice I could give is have a look at Nextflow, because we've had a bunch of people use that on the Pawsey application team, so we can provide possibly more help than we could with some of the other ones.
Okay, cool. That's a good tip. Yeah, I'll narrows it down a little bit.
Yeah, it certainly makes it a lot easier when you do have sort of all the steps from start to finish captured and written down somewhere, because that way you can kind of go back and look at it and know exactly what happened from start to finish, and then just, and also it can be a little frustrating in that it's a lot of extra work at the front end, because you have to kind of learn the new tool, set it all up. But once you've invested that effort, when you come back, you might find you only need to make a little change, and then you just rerun it again, and you don't have to do all that manual work the second and third and fourth time. And in that regard, it kind of pays off in the long run.
Cool. Yeah, definitely. As well, part of my new role is sort of to make a bit of a template for other researchers that might not be as computational savvy. So I guess also picking something that is fairly easy to use as well. But cool, yeah, I'll look into Nextflow and see if I can figure out a better way to manage all the programs and things a bit better.
And I think while we've been talking about yours in particular, I think there's a lot of things that cover across workflows, right? So there are a lot of things that we're talking about, I think, that spreads across the group.
Is there anybody else who has a question, or people feel like they've fleshed out at least a diagram of workflows, of their workflow? They possibly maybe more than one. It's possible that you have 2 major workflows or 6.
You'll have a chance to revisit this later. So
yes. I think we might as well move to the next portion then. Feel free to keep jotting down some ideas. There we are. So I'll hand over to Chris. So,
and now for something completely different, we're going to talk about cake baking, which is super fun. So our rationale for doing this is that it provides, I guess, a framework for thinking about workflows in a way that's a little bit, it allows you to take a step back and look at the bigger picture, I think, by removing a lot of the actual computational details. So our plan here is we're going to split everyone out into some breakout groups, I think. Is that still the plan? Yep. And within each group, we want to come up with a workflow for creating a cake. And so the things we want to think about is all the steps that you need to do in order to produce that cake. So you've got to think about things like where are the ingredients at the shop? They're not necessarily there in the kitchen. What steps do you need to do to prepare the ingredients to sort of get them all mixed together, cooked? When you've got your cake, what are you going to do to make it look nice? You put icing on it, things like that. And even thinking about if there's any of those steps that you could potentially be doing at the same time. And then we'll see where we go from there.
That sounds good. Everyone ready to go into breakout rooms? Perfect. The rooms are opening now. You'll receive an invite. Okay, Hoyt and Stephen, you should be receiving an invite. There we go. Perfect. Everybody's in breakout rooms. How long should we give them before we tell them that? Oh, just kidding. We want you now to change.
I'd say at least 2 or 3 minutes, maybe 5 minutes.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, we definitely want to give them time to put
minutes.
something together, and I suspect it's, oh, hello. We've got Shady. I'm not sure if that was a new participant or someone that's come out of the breakout rooms.
Oh, okay. Hi, Shady. Stephen is, I'm going to put Stephen into a room then. Because he's by himself at the moment. Hi, Shady, can you hear us?
Yes,
Hi, did you receive an invite to go into a room?
I did, but then like, I don't know, it was
It's
gone.
probably, yeah, it can be with Zoom. Let me, I'm going to send for another one right now.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we'll try again. Here we go.
Did you receive a link, Shady? An invitation or no?
No, I haven't received it.
Because it looks like you're in that room. Sometimes it gets lost in space. Okay.
Maybe it'd be worth
Do you want me to
disconnecting and reconnecting.
and then join?
Yeah, you might have to reconnect, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, do you mind? Sometimes it gets caught if they click, I don't know, you click somehow and it just gets caught.
Yeah. I miss doing this stuff in person. It's just the energy is so,
Yeah.
I know. It's so much fun to walk around the room and yeah, it's so different.
Yeah.
But we'll get there. Okay, it's been about 3 minutes. So who we've got, okay, here we go.
Okay.
Hi, Shady, are you back?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yep, looks like. Can you hear us?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I am going to send an invite.
Okay. Okay.
And you should be receiving that then.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so we've got 2 rooms.
Okay. Maybe
And
Pascal and I could take
so
one each.
that's,
Yeah.
Do you want to go the big cake
And
or
who's
the
gonna do
1,000
what?
cakes, Pascal? Or the 10-minute cake?
I'm going to try the 10-minute cake. I'm going to get them to see if they can think about how to make a cake ridiculously quick.
Okay, I'm going to go with a massive cake, 1-ton cake.
okay, so I'll just put you in whichever.
And before, do we
you're going-
want to share slides in the breakout rooms? I don't know if we can share a screen share in the breakout rooms or not.
You should be able to. You just,
Cool.
well, I don't know,
Give it a
but you
try.
should be able to, yeah.
Yeah, we'll try.
Okay, I'm putting Chris in room 1 and Pascal.
We've
you're
just
going
got
to room
Natasha
2.
back. Natasha's back.
Okay, Natasha is new. Hi, Natasha.
Right, Microsoft work, and then it shut me out of my breakout group, unfortunately.
Oh, who are you with? Oh, I see. You're in room 1, but you're really not in room 1. Okay, yeah, you were with.
Sorry about that.
That's
With
okay.
Victor
Let me try.
and Hoyt.
Yes.
And all
Yep.
them, yeah.
Okay, okay, it's not. I'm going to move you into room 3, and then I'm going to move you back into room 1 because it's not letting me, for some reason, put you in where you were. So I'm going to
Okay.
move you twice. Okay, so you'll get two invitations.
Yeah.
Actually, let me. It says you're not here, but I'm going to assign you to the main. Here we go. I've got you now. Okay, there we go. You should be getting the invitation.
I was in this group had the challenge of baking a 1-ton cake. And perhaps, Victor, would you like to talk about some of the things that came up that were challenging in terms of adjusting the workflow?
Sure. I don't know if I can show the screen.
Yeah. Is Victor able to do a screen share, Anne? Because they had a really good, I guess, layout of what they were discussing and talking about.
Let me
Sure.
just see there. Yes, yes, you're enabled to share now, Victor.
Okay, I'll give it a go. So where's the yep, snip sketch. Are you able to? I was able to take a screenshot just before the breakout session ended. So we tried our best because at the start there was not all of us had our audio enabled. So we're doing it to the chat at first. So I guess that's first of all, that's the initial challenge we're having before even get to the actual process of trying to make the 1-ton cake. So initially we were just thinking, we didn't have the 1-ton in mind. So we're just trying to think of how to make the cake on a normal sized one. So we had, of course, we need, not many of us are very versed in, that's the impression I got. Not many of us are good at baking cakes. So we had a recipe book, and we're also thinking about the equipment that we would need. And then with this, we would then need to go to the shop. It's here, but it should be somewhere here. Shops that we can get these things that we can then begin the preparation. But at this point, Christopher came in and told us that we need a 1-ton cake. So we don't have an actual recipe, but we realized we need to scale it for a 1-ton size cake. And we also had to consider whether we're going to make one overall, like one holistic 1-ton cake, or make little portions of it that we can then, through some the chocolate or somehow make it into a 1-ton cake. So we try to go the realistic way. So that means we can't do it in our own kitchen, our own residential kitchens. And in terms of the equipment, we thought of, again, realistically, rather than have one giant mixer, it would make sense to have multiple mixers and multiple ovens that we can then make the little batches and then make it into one. So that's the bigger bit here. And then just something rough in terms of mixing the dry ingredients first. Didn't have, I think other thing we were thinking about here is in terms of the processing and visualization was doing the baking and the icing. No, that actually doesn't make sense. Oh, maybe it does. The baking, while that's happening in the oven, we can simultaneously start preparing the icing. So that was more of an efficiency improvement to the workflow. And then someone brought up archiving, and we tried to understand how archiving works in the context of making a cake. Well, but the best was really storage. Being a massive cake and perhaps takes a significant amount of effort to make it. We would prefer to store it in the freezer or whatever. At this point, that's where we got, so we thought of storing it in the freezer. So that is really our rush to our workflow with the time and the constraints we had.
That's really good. I would have thought archiving would just be eating the cake.
Well, yeah, now that thinking of it, that's some sort of archiving as well.
I'm definitely familiar with cakes that have sat at the back of my fridge, fruitcakes, for a long period of time before we finally get around to eating them. So it probably depends on the cake.
Really good. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's all I had.
Cool.
Very cool.
Thank you.
So for the 10-minute cake, sorry, Chris, I was going to ask if anybody wanted to lead the 10-minute cake discussion between, let's say, Siobhan or Jingbo or Said's, I guess maybe hopefully in the breakout room. We'll see if we can get her back. But did either of you want to lead the discussion, like present what you talked about?
Hey guys, anyone from our room wanted to talk about what we discussed?
Sure, I can if you like. So we didn't know how many people we had, but we assumed we had a lot of people. But we also at the start said that like sometimes always having more people doesn't always, you got to have either really good workflow written down when you have that many people. So we thought maybe like dividing the ingredients. So in the first step, getting the ingredients, we divide them by like the cold stuff and the pantry stuff to clearly define roles, so people like get exactly what they need. But then we then can have multiple people like doing certain jobs, like, you know, cracking eggs or measuring milk or whatever. But there's also parts where we're kind of limited that only one person can do, like maybe the mixing is really only a one-person job. Having two people do that, you know, might not make it much quicker. And then I guess design the cake so that it cooks as quickly as possible, or maybe even making like a no-bake cake. Could make a, you know, one of the ones you put in the fridge for a little bit, or a -80 if you have access to a -80. And then like, I guess making the icing maybe while it's cooking and things like that. I'm sure I missed out. Does anyone else want to chime in on what else we talked about?
I'm happy to add a few extra cake that we were thinking. I think this exercise really helped us to break down the big task into every single step that we have to go through and look across which one can do in parallel than others. And there are sequential parts and also parallel parts. One thing, one comment in addition is that it also will be helpful to add more like the scheduling function, which is communication. If some step is stuck or broken or get something wrong in our program or in the workflow, we got to handle that exception. So that's a pretty kind of a standard programming practice that we always have a checkpoint and see what's going on rather than assuming everything going well by default. Yeah, that's my comment.
I think that's very cool. It's a very good discussion on the cake baking exercise. So let's go back to the cakes again. So we've talked about the cakes and gotten you to think about these tasks. And so then the next thing to do is to actually, you know, we've had this conversation sort of how were the workflows the same, how were they different? Victor had a nice step of, okay, then we had to scale by 1 ton. And I guess one of the things we didn't chat about is how did you respond to the change? So how did you guys start thinking about the request change, right? If you go from a cake to making a 1-ton cake, did it throw you off? Did you have to really go, okay, do we need to rethink stuff? Or did you feel like you could just start scaling things in a naive fashion? Go ahead, Chris.
What was it that you did in order to deal with the fact that you had this change?
Did anybody want from the 1-ton cake have want to comment at all about how what you did to change the going from a cake to a 1-ton cake, like the process of thinking about it?
The obvious change is that when we do one cake, we only need one oven. It's doable, but 1-ton cake, there's no 1-ton oven to be able to do that. So we have to break down. That's a change that we have to do when scale up.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting observation, because I think exactly the same thing is what you see in computing. We have our programs that are written for a single processor, but there is no 1-ton processor. Our modern supercomputers are lots and lots of processors that are put together, and we have to figure out ways of breaking our problem down into smaller pieces that can run on all those processors in order to sort of get to that end result, be it a really big cake or lots of cakes quite quickly. It's how you make use of the fact that you're using lots of these resources all working together. I think that's a really interesting observation.
Yep. Any other comments at all that someone would like to make?
Yep. Just from my end as well, I think the other thing that more overall is whether it's possible. Like that's the. I mean, I know it's also like a hypothetical situation, but then one of the first things that came to my mind is it actually possible to do it? And what if someone actually expects you to do this? I mean, it is possible, but then like whether we can achieve it. That was the other difficulty that just initially came in.
I'm now thinking back to my time as a research student and thinking exactly the same thing. Is this possible? Why am I being asked to do this?
It's a very good point you raised, because for the 10-minute cake, I mean, I think Siobhan mentioned, like, how would you bake, and Jimbo as well, how would you bake it in 10 minutes? So the no bake is a great idea. You know, you're just a completely different alternative path to making a cake. And so there's things you have to think about. Like, is it possible? How would do I have to change some of the actual full approach, right? Oh, there we are. So we should probably go into how this way to your e-research workflow. And I might hand off to Chris for the discussion here.
Yeah, sure. So as I just mentioned, modern supercomputers are those lots of processes working together, so breaking things down is critical. So what you can see here on the left is a task, T1, and it has all these different stages in it. And as long as the stages don't have dependencies between them, you can potentially do them at the same time. And so by doing things at the same time, you can reduce the amount of time it takes to reach your final result. And this is what we refer to as parallelism. And there's lots of different types of parallelism that you may encounter, different approaches you can take depending on the type of problem that you have. Yeah, I think the only other thing that is worth bringing up on this slide is one of the key things about a modern supercomputer. It has lots and lots and lots of processors on it, but the other thing that makes it really special is it has a really fast network between each of those processors. So when they're working on a problem together, they can sort of share information very quickly, and that means that you're not going to be sort of held back as much by the dependencies and the sharing of information between all these processes collaboratively working on the problem. And I guess is what makes a supercomputer special and different from, say, a a lot of different computers just connected together by the internet, for example. You may have heard of things like SETI at home. For some types of algorithms, that might work well. But for some types of algorithms, you really need the data's tightly coupled and you need it sitting on a supercomputer and all talking together really quickly.
Yeah, the SETI at home is a nice example because normally you have a collection of data that's just sitting in a database and they just want you to process a packet, so that processing is completely independent, so they can just keep farming out packets and collect them back. And that's the end result of the entire workflow, right? Is that you process, you get another packet, you process. And if you think of more complicated, or not complicated, but very different workflows where the communication has to be, did you finish your task right now? Because we have the next step to do. And that requires really fast communication. That's where supercomputers really excel because of that. So that's where that workflow really excels on a supercomputer, because you just need to communicate right away that you've done. You don't want to wait too long. So the idea here is, can we help you, and also can you think of how you would optimize your own workflow for a supercomputer? Would you need to optimize the workflow? That difference of sort of SETI at home, where there's the communication is minimal or almost non-existent, and you just do packets as they come along, and going for something that doesn't do that type of workflow, but you need to really think about how you optimize. When do you need to go to the type of processing that would be necessary that is only provided by a supercomputer, by the many, many ovens connected, turned on at the same time to bake a cake. And it's possible that your workflow is complex enough so that maybe different bits could be parallelized differently. So Siobhan mentioned that she's got a workflow, but maybe some portions of it don't necessarily need a supercomputer, but other portions might really benefit from a supercomputer. This is good to have this discussion and think about this. How you
may also be in a situation where the work that you're doing, you're not hitting these boundaries in terms of being limited in terms of how long it takes to run or how much memory you need, and thus, like, why would I need to use a supercomputer in any part of it? And so one thing, if you are in that situation, you may want to consider is, do you have any artificial limitations to the work that you're doing where you've framed it from a point of view of, this is the work that I'm doing because this is what I have available in terms of computational resources. If I had more time and access to more infrastructure, would I be able to increase the resolution of a simulation or the amount of data that I'm working with? Are there things that you've sort of limited out of necessity that you could be doing in more detail?
And future looking as well. Maybe you don't need to do that type of data analysis, but maybe in the future, the science you want to do eventually will maybe tell you, oh, I need to start moving to something bigger, like a supercomputer. So I know we're running shortish on time, but I guess I just quickly want to ask, does anybody have some thoughts here before we move on? If they think that when they look at the workflow that they've drawn up, can they see portions of their workflow that they've done that where, like, maybe you would want to eventually or need to move to a supercomputer? I'll let you contemplate that, because it's not obvious. It may not be immediately evident what is necessary or whether you need to or not.
Can I just add one more comment,
Sure.
Pascal? I think one common thing I found is that if I have to move, I have to move. But if I can stay in whatever available workflow, sometimes the time I would rather spend on my research, then I may decide keep as it is. But at some point, when I reach to the bottleneck where I can't achieve what I wanted to, and then I have to change anyway.
Yeah, I think that's a very,
Agreed.
It's not an uncommon, and it's a pretty common thing. And like, you have to do your research. And so,
Yeah.
When you need to, you kind of really go, okay, I'm going to move now. But it's just to get you thinking about this. Just to again emphasize the point, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, do you want me
Go
to
ahead,
talk this one?
go for the longest.
Yeah. So I think one of the key points that you may hit when you're doing computational work where, I guess, ways of that you might want to recognize, hey, I might need sort of bigger infrastructure to do the work. An obvious one is where you go to run something on your laptop and workstation and it's just not sufficient. And so this might be the program that you're running for the particular data set that you're now starting to run it on. Before on other data sets, it might have been quite quick. It might have taken minutes, hours to kind of run, and then you suddenly hit this larger data set, and then suddenly you start running it, and it doesn't stop, right? and then you try and figure out how long it's going to take. You go, oh, this is going to take months to get through. That's a point where suddenly it's worth taking the time to engage with the infrastructure to try and get that back down to something where you're going to get a result in a meaningful time. Another one that's quite common is you don't have enough memory on your system to fit the data that you're working on in memory. And it's also worth noting that a lot of computers are configured so that when you run out of memory or RAM, it starts using the hard drive. And so it kind of spills out of memory onto the hard drive and still tries to complete the processing. And the hard drive is about 1,000 times slower than memory. And what will happen is the moment your problem kind of goes over and starts using the hard drive, you'll notice that the runtime of your program will suddenly blow out and it will take a lot longer to process because it's hitting that extra access time. And so it's really useful to be aware of how much memory you're using when you're running the programs, and having a sense of, for a particular data set and workflow, what your memory footprint is. And it might be that you'll suddenly get to a point where you're like, oh, actually to run this quickly, I need 1 terabyte of memory. And I don't have 1 terabyte of memory in my laptop. And so that's another point where it might be worth moving to supercomputing resources where we do have nodes that have a lot of memory on them. Or if you have an extremely large memory, then you have to start looking at how you would split that problem into multiple processes on different nodes of the computer to kind of pool the memory of all the different nodes together for the communication between. Finally, I think another common one is when your data set's too large to fit on the computer. And so you might be working with gigabytes or into the terabytes, and if it fits on a portable hard drive, you're probably okay. But when you start having to sort of shuffle portable hard drives through to try and get your work going, and you're juggling portable hard drives, that's the point where it's just going to be easier to do it on supercomputing infrastructure because our file systems are petabytes. So you don't have to do that logistical managing of trying to juggle your data. You can just have it all sitting there and work with it on the systems. And so it's actually easier. And so that's another good use case for considering using infrastructure. Yeah. Next slide. So we also have our cloud resources. So one of the big differences between the supercomputing and the cloud resources is, I guess, the supercomputing is that big shared resource where you potentially have access to thousands of nodes all at the same time, but you're sharing it with lots of other users. So there's a scheduler that's there to make sure that it's being utilized all the time. And you may have to wait in queue for hours before your job starts running, for example. And the reason why people do this is because the jobs are at a scale where you can't run them anywhere else. So you kind of have to eat the fact that you have to wait in queue for an hour. Or the performance improvement you're getting, it's like, well, if I was running this somewhere else, it would take months for it to complete. Whereas here, I wait a couple of hours, it runs overnight, and I get my results the next day. So that's a win. So there, I guess, use cases where you'd want that. Whereas the cloud, you have your own virtual machine, and it's something that you are responsible for yourself. And The advantage of it is that you can access it at any time and have that responsive work with it. But I guess some of the drawbacks of it is you're more responsible for, I guess, managing the operating system and adding users to your virtual machine. And you also sort of, if your computational workflow is bigger than one node, then it's probably a point where you want to transition up onto the supercomputer. So I guess the advantages is you've got complete control over the environment, and you can access it sort of as needed. I think that's all I have to say about that one.
Yep. So we've talked about workflows and also the differences in terms of the infrastructure that could be useful for your workflow. Does anybody have any questions about their workflows? Maybe follow-up questions later on with like how to get help later on about workflows. We certainly can provide you details of that as well. I might say that if anybody who's not on a supercomputer yet and is wondering how to take the first set of steps and is kind of maybe migrating from their laptop to the supercomputer, but that's quite daunting because you have to write proposals on Nimbus. The cloud computing is a kind of a way to maybe to introduce yourself to that type of environment, even though it's managed and it's not a supercomputer. It's at least maybe a way of going up. So it's possible that your group could put in a Nimbus application, get used to the idea of having more resources and maybe testing some parallelization out if you've never tried running stuff in parallel before. And then that would allow you to then possibly migrate to a supercomputer. So there could be, just to give people a sense of what a possible process, a path forward would be if they've never done this before. Is that there could be a path forward, because parallelizing workflows, at least normally maybe you could get the idea down, but doing it in practice can take a while and take some effort. Well, if there are no further questions, remember that we have Pawsey training material on YouTube. There's also training material on the website itself. You can become a Pawsey friend and get newsletters and so on about Pawsey events to get help and training in going to supercomputers or even Nimbus and help with your workflows. And did you want to say anything else?
Oh, can I just add one more comment? I really like the session, and I wish that when I was a student, I wish I have this session. So I'm better prepared to accelerate my very slow workflow. So thank you so much, guys, for very, very clear. And I really like the cake analogy.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. Any other final questions before we wrap up the session?
I did have one, if that's okay. Great session. Thanks, guys. I've been a Pawsey user for a while, but like I said, I'm always on and off and have to refresh my brain on some things. With the database side of things now, because again, I'm from a genomics point of view, but I guess maybe from biological science more generally, there's lots of like generic databases that you have to use, like BLAST or something like that, to identify your genes or whatever it is. And I know I spoke a little while ago with some people at Pawsey, and there was some talk about it, but if there was a central place to store those databases at Pawsey, instead of everyone individually having to download the databases, and they're getting bigger and bigger by the day, where it used to be kind of manageable, but now it takes up my whole volume storage.
We do store a number of common data sets, particularly for BLAST.
Okay.
So that's something we do on the supercomputing systems.
Yeah, okay.
And as part of moving towards our new capital refresh of all the systems, we'll be having, I guess, an update to the way that we do our data storage. Okay. And I suspect that it will be easy to access these data sets from Nimbus as well in the future. Okay. Yeah, I would love to put you in touch with one of my colleagues, Sarah Beecroft, who has been doing a lot of work in this area, because I think her being aware of your workflows would really help us have a clear idea of the way that we implement that shared databases on our new infrastructure. So that'd be really helpful, I think.
Awesome. Yeah, I did meet with Sarah probably, I think it was before COVID, just before COVID. We had a chat, but like I said, I'm very in and out of the computational, probably like Sarah, similar to what Sarah used to be. You in the lab and then you come back and things update. And now it's just, yeah, I tried to download it recently and it took up my whole volume storage. It's just getting exponentially bigger. I think it's becoming almost unfeasible for me to keep it locally.
Yeah, I definitely recommend reaching out to Sarah again.
Yeah, I will.
Chat about it. I think she'd find it really useful.
Cool. I will do that. Thank you.
Great question. Any other final questions? Otherwise, thank you very much to our presenters, Pascal and Chris, and thank you all for joining and baking some cakes with us today. No big cake, that was a good one. We hadn't had that one before. So we hope that you also found it helpful and informative. And thank you for your time.